Good evening, and thank you for joining us at this first webinar from the Writing Center. Referring to Howard Gardner's new memoir, A Synthesizing Mind, Steven Pinker has said, "It's a cause for celebration that one of our most influential living psychologists has trained his insight onto his own life and work." Howard of Cognition and Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, the author of 30 scholarly books, and is best known as the originator of the theory of multiple intelligences, about which he'd prefer to speak less rather than more this evening. Please allow me to welcome Howard Gardner as our guest great thinker of the 2021 spring season, the first one, at the Frumkes Center here at Hunter College.
Thank you, Lewis. It's always a pleasure to be with you. And since we can't do it in person, it's good that Zoom is allow us to do it remotely.
Lewis, just turn on your mic.
We're not hearing you, Lewis.
Lewis, just hit unmute on the bottom left.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, don't touch the mute. Just don't touch it at all.
I'm not touching anything.
Yeah, good. Okay.
Howard, good.
Now I can hear you. Yes.
Was the audience able to hear? All right. Well, do I have to repeat my introduction?
No, I think just go to the question.
Howard, good evening.
Good evening again. Yeah. I think Lewis is freezing.
The questions. Can you hear? Piaget considered himself a genetic epistemologist. Do you think of yourself like that, Howard?
Well, the person who got me into studying the human mind was Jean Piaget, the great psychologist. And he studied children and how their minds work. And when I read Piaget, I said, this is fascinating. It's the kind of thing that I would like to do. And even though Piaget has long passed from the scene, a lot of my own work has been kind of a conversation with Piaget, where I agree with him, where I disagree with him, and so on. The phrase genetic epistemology is a mouthful, but I certainly am interested in knowledge, which is epistemology, and I'm interested in how it develops, which is genetic. So in that sense, it's an okay describer of me, though the reason I wrote the book, A Synthesizing Mind, is because I think what I really am is a synthesizer.
It's certainly not as good a description as a synthesizer. In any event,
Less of a mouth.
Let's move on. Are you there, Howard?
Yes.
When you were 10 years old, you played the piano quite well. How has music played into a role in your life?
Except for my family, there's nothing that's more important to me than music. I stopped playing the piano seriously when I was in high school, but every day I play for 30, 40, 50 minutes. I play mostly classical music, but I play jazz and pop music as well. And what I discovered in writing A Synthesizing Mind is that even though I'm a writer of language rather than a writer of musical notes, it's my understanding of the classical form, particularly sonatas and symphonies, which has a big influence on how I write. So we might say that I draw on musical intelligence, even though writing is using linguistic intelligence.
I had a feeling you were sensitive to music in your writing. Most writers, there is a rhythm and a cadence to language, and most of us do have some musical sense of the language. It was, if I'm not mistaken, you mentioned in the book that it was Murray Gell-Mann, the physicist, who first coined the term synthesizing mind, which impressed you a great deal. Why did that at the time of his speaking it impress you so that later on you would use it for the title of your memoir?
Okay, well, I have a better answer to that question than is contained in the memoir, because even though The Synthesizing Mind has been published, I've continued to go through my own youthful writings. And in fact, for about 40 years, I've been talking about myself as a synthesizer. I had just forgotten that. But about 25 years ago, this great physicist said, in the 21st century, the most important mind will be a synthesizing mind. And he wasn't talking about me. He didn't know anything about me. He was just talking. But what I believe is that nowadays, with all sorts of factual information at your fingertips, we don't have to spend huge amounts of time calling books from the library and poring things over, and we can write them down and preserve them in our on our computers or on our smartphones. So it's the ability to take lots and lots of disparate information which other people haven't organized, and putting it together in ways which are sensible to us, but also sensible to other people. I think that's a particular premium now. And Gell-Mann was a polymath. Even though he got his Nobel Prize in physics, he spoke many languages. He did anthropology, he did biology. He started the Santa Fe Institute, which is by its very nature the study of complex systems. So I think he saw more clearly, certainly than I did, that this ability to gather, organize, reorganize, package, send out is really the most important capacity nowadays. Whereas, it might have been just memorizing equations or vocabulary 100 years ago.
You spent a good 10 years with two people, Bill Damon and Csikszentmihalyi, who collaborated with you on a number of books. Can you tell us about your friendship with those two gentlemen and what they mean to you, and what that 10-year period represents in you spoke of it generously in the book.
Yeah, well, let me provide a little context. When you are a empirical researcher, as I am, I carried out studies with children and adults and brain damage patients and so on, you have lots of collaboration. You can't do it alone. But the collaborations work best, for the most part, when they're with people whom you also like and enjoy being with and having a drink with and going on holidays. In fact, I spoke with Bill Damon this last weekend. He's in California, I'm in New York, and that friendship has now endured for decades. But 25 years ago, we found ourselves together at a research center, and we all became interested in the same issue, namely, is it possible to be creative, generative, and at the same time to do good? Because of course, there's lots of creativity which isn't good, or lots of creativity which is very mixed. I mean, is the atomic bomb good or bad? You can't give it a simple plus or minus. And that conversation yielded ultimately a project called the Good Work Project, which I've actually been working on now for over 25 years. My colleagues have moved on to other things. And we're interested in work that's not only excellent and engaging. We all would like to have work that's done well and that is meaningful to us, but work that's carried out in a good or ethical way. And this question keeps me up every night, because we live in a time now where we have tremendous technological and computational skills and capacities, But is that going to be used in a positive direction or not? That is the big question. And it has a lot to do with synthesizing. There is a company which some people may have heard of called Palantir, Palantir. It advertises itself as the world's greatest synthesizer. It works for governments, it works for the military. It says, you give me the facts, I'll synthesize them. And I say,
Been
great.
very much in the news lately.
That's right. I say, great, let's have Palantir, but I don't want Palantir to decide what questions to look at. And I certainly don't want it to decide what actions to take. That has to be done by human beings talking to one another and not simply by an algorithm.
When I asked you about these two friends and collaborators, there are a number of very special people who you regard either as heroes and some who were mentors. I'm thinking of Edmund Wilson, Richard Hofstadter, whom you admired, and I'm thinking of Jerome Bruner and Eric Erikson, who actually were mentors of yours. Talk about some of your feelings about them when you were going to school and how they may have influenced you in becoming a synthesizing mind.
Okay. Yes, well, I entered college many years ago, and I studied a field which no longer exists except in history books called social relations. It was an amalgam between psychology, sociology, and anthropology. And for me, as somebody interested in human beings and the human mind, this was like a Garden of Eden. I took courses with some of the people who you mentioned. I read their books, and I basically wanted to do what they did, which was not just be a psychologist or just be an anthropologist or just be a sociologist or just be a historian or just be an economist, but to try to bring those academic disciplines together to understand better the human experience, so to speak. And it's interesting because both of the people who you mentioned, Bill Damon and Mike Csikszentmihalyi, were trained at the same time with the same interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary tack, not just doing psychological experiments, but studying different cultures, looking at groups, looking at professions, things like that. I'm lucky because I went to a good college, Harvard, and I seem to have had a gift for attracting mentors. I also write in the book, as you know, about tormentors and anti-mentors, because there are people who you look up to, but who can treat you very nastily, very meanly, or can reject you.
Sure.
And I talk in the book about Stanley Milgram, a great psychologist, the man who studied obedience to authority, who was a tormentor because he just attacked me in public viciously, and I never understood why. And now when I have students, or well, even grad students, students of students, I try to be a positive mentor, but I also try to encourage them to have more than one mentor. We created the phrase fragmentoring. You shouldn't be just focused on one person. You should take something from Erikson, something from Reisman, something from Hofstadter. And I should mention, when I went to college, decades ago, there were very few professors who were not men. They were almost all men. And so my mentors were primarily men. But somebody whom I learned a lot from, even though I never met her, was Margaret Mead, who was also a great synthesizer. Suzanne Langer, a philosopher whose book, Philosophy in a New Key, had an enormous impact on me when I read it as a college freshman. And now it's good to see so many more women writers, people like Jill Lepore or Mary Beard, who are doing the kind of synthesizing and teaching in ways that 50 years ago, 60 years ago, you had very few like that.
As someone who has spent a lifetime trying not only to understand the mind, but also the language, and who has a great command of the language, you've said that the work you've done on non-literal language and the brain is among the most important contributions you've ever made to science. Can you explain that a little?
Sure. Again, let me give a little context. When you're trained in psychology, as I was, you're expected to do experiments and write them up in articles and then write another article. And I did that. I paid my dues. But one of the reasons I decided to call myself a synthesizer is because, unlike 99% of research psychologists, I'm basically a book writer. And it's difficult for me to say something in, 1,000 words. I like to say it in 50,000 words. But I did do experiments. And the one experiment which I did, which I think was probably the most important, was done with Ellen Winter, to whom I'm married. And we discovered that when people have brain damage and lose abilities, counter to what one might think, even though metaphor is language, understanding of metaphor seems to call for the non-language parts of the brain, the right hemisphere. So the paradox is that even though language is housed in the left hemisphere, the understanding and appreciation of metaphor seems to be in the right hemisphere. And of course, we studied it at the time by studying people who had left hemisphere damage or right hemisphere damage. Now, of course, you could do scans of various sorts, MRIs, and you wouldn't have to, you could do it on normal people. So here's an example. If you said that somebody has a heavy heart and you showed patients a picture, patients who have right hemisphere damage will show somebody who is carrying around a heavy heart. They'll take it literally. Whereas patients who have left hemisphere damage, even though they've language damage, they'll know when you talk about somebody having a heavy heart, it's someone who looks forlorn. And that was a very counterintuitive finding. Of course, in science, it's all finding just a brick for the edifice. And now we have much more complicated understanding of these things. But if you do an experiment which affects the field, that's a very good feeling. I had that feeling particularly with my book, Frames of Mind, which you kindly said should not be the topic for this evening. But when I talked about different kinds of intelligence, that probably caught on more than anything else that I have done. And it affected the way people talk about one another. And that was very gratifying too, but it wasn't really an experiment. It was a synthesis. For people who know the book, it's 400 pages.
I certainly didn't mean to suggest that you weren't proud of that area of your work, and that of course it has become part of our fund of everyone's fund of knowledge. It was a huge change in the way we regarded human intelligence. And speaking of important aspects of your work, one of the most important and one that has occupied you for a long time is Project Zero. And most people know you, but they don't know exactly what Project Zero is and how much you have devoted to that area of work.
Yeah, let me first say what it is, and then I'll tell you why it has that funny name. It is a research project based at the Graduate School of Education at Harvard. And we basically study education. And the way I like to describe it is we develop ideas and concepts in education, and we give them a push in the right direction. We don't run schools or museums or businesses, but we try to help institutions which want to make use of our work. Project Zero now is quite big. There are about 25 different projects going on. I've run a few of them, but I don't even know all of them. We have over a dozen people who can apply for grants. And you may say, well, you're at Harvard, so there's lots of money. Actually, we have to raise all the money, all the salaries, and Harvard takes a chunk, which is appropriate. We always joke, Harvard doesn't giveth, it taketh away. And so it takes overhead from all the work we do. But Project Zero was begun by a very eminent philosopher named Nelson Goodman. It was begun in 1967. So it's over 53 years old. And he was interested as a philosopher in the nature of artistic thinking. But he said, there's lots of lore about how you train an artist and how artists work, but there's very little systematic work done on that. And so we're going to call our research project Project Zero. And even though a lot of funders have nudged us to change the name. We like the name of Zero because we always say it reveals nothing. And I actually met my wife, Ellen Winter, at Project Zero, and that's where we began to work on metaphor. She's much more of an expert on metaphor than I am. And we only do work which fills two criteria. First, it has to interest us. And second of all, we have to be able to get money for it. So if somebody offers us a lot of money, but we're not interested, we don't do it. And if we have something we're very interested in, but we don't have the money, we can't do it. And that makes us very unusual because most soft money enterprises, that's the word for places that have to raise money all the time, go looking for what's being funded and just go for that. But we're pretty, we value our time, and we don't want to study something unless we think that we will learn something and that it'll be useful to other people. And it's certainly my proudest professional association is the wonderful people I've worked with at Project Zero for many, many years. When Damon, Csikszentmihalyi, and I began the Good Work Project 25 years ago, Damon was actually on our steering committee at Project Zero. He was one of the persons who was helping us run it. He has since moved to Stanford, and Csikszentmihalyi has since moved to Claremont, Southern California. So I'm the only one left on the East Coast. But Project Zero has been a really important part of many, many people's lives. And I'd like to think it's made a difference in education. One interesting thing, Lewis, is when you and I first met, almost all of our work was done in the United States. Now, most of our work is done overseas. And the good news is that people in other countries are really interested in what we have to say about education. The less good news, which many of the people who are listening, if they're Americans, will know, is American public education has moved very much toward just giving tests to people and following a very narrow kind of curriculum. And if you're interested in the arts and humanities and broader kinds of thinking, it's only some schools, usually either independent schools or schools in quite affluent environments, Scarsdale or Hollywood or Brookline, where kids have a more flexible Project Zero kind of curriculum. And
Yes.
I mentioned earlier that it was Piaget's mind that got me interested in my research, but it was working with Jerome Bruner, a wonderful psychologist who died at the age of 100 plus just a few years ago, working with him on a curriculum called Man, A Course of Study, which was developed in 1965 in Newton, Massachusetts. And it was a curriculum in social studies, maybe that's a conglomeration of history, anthropology, and so on. And let me see if I can remember. Man, A Course of Study, again, a name we now would see as very sexist, but at the time it was just a general name, asked three questions. What makes human beings human? How do they get to be that way? And what makes them more so? And those three questions have had enormous influence on me. What makes human beings human? How do we get that way? How to make us more so? And the curriculum had enormous popularity in the 60s. And my children who went to a good school in the Boston area had it in the 80s. But the curriculum was, it was destroyed by a right-wing Congress who thought it was too, shall we say, too progressive, because we studied things in Man, A Course of Study, like the Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert and the Netsilik Eskimos. And this is shades of what we've gone through for the last few years in this country. Why aren't we just studying America? Why are we studying these other groups? But dreams don't die permanently unless we let them. So it was, for me, the questions that Bruner asked and the way that Piaget approached them and the other people I work with and the people I was inspired by, like Margaret Mead, that have kept me going. And I've tried to pass that on to my students. And I get a lot of correspondence from all over the world because with the internet now, it's very easy to do. And I try either directly or through correspondence to transmit some of these things to them. And in a synthesizing mind, I reproduced some letters that I got. When I was a kid, literally 23, 24, a graduate student, I wrote a letter to Piaget, the great psychologist, and to Claude Lévi-Strauss, a great anthropologist. I was inspired by their work. On an April 10th, 1970, so over 50 years ago, the same day I got answers from both of them, Piaget in French, Lévi-Strauss in excellent English. And the fact that these giants would write to me, a graduate student who they knew nothing about, made enormous impact on me. And I've never forgotten it. Also in the book, as you know, I have letters from Groucho Marx, whom I invited to Harvard. He wrote a very funny letter about why this, he said, I'd like to come, but I got to work in the hills of Beverly. It's called making a living. And I also wrote to Edmund Wilson, who was one of my heroes. And he sent back a form saying he didn't do X, Y, and Z. So he declined, as did Groucho. But I saved the envelope. And then recently, because on the internet now you can get people's signatures, I saw that Edmund Wilson had actually addressed the letter to me and done the checklist. So that's in the book too. So the book contains some memorabilia and something which would have meaning for you, though maybe not for younger people. A picture of me with Adlai Stevenson, who ran unsuccessfully for president in 1952 and 56. I was a fan of his. And perhaps one thing that listeners tonight, viewers will find amusing, is I shared two features with Joe Biden. We're the same age, and we both come from Scranton, Pennsylvania. He was born and spent the first 11 years of his life there, and I was born and I grew up there. We didn't know each other, and he certainly doesn't know me. But one thing, if you were growing up in Scranton those days, it wasn't a very desirable place, but you felt you could do anything. And that's a gift that I wish more young people had today, feel they could do anything.
Well, I think both of you have put Scranton on the map. In any event, let me, before I turn the evening over to the audience to ask you some questions, and I hope they've been thinking of some good questions. Let me ask you this: you've written on numerous subjects, and you've written eloquently and voluminously. So 20 or 30 books is no mean accomplishment. What are your writing habits like?
Okay, well, that's a great question. Like many other writers, I love to write. That doesn't mean there's no agony, where I'm wrestling every night with the title of a new book because we can't agree on it. But I love to write, and writing clarifies my thinking. In fact, the old joke, how do you know what you think unless you see what you've written? And that's for me. So every day I walk early in the morning, and I think about issues, and then I sit down and I write about them. I never wrote essays, but I have written several hundred blogs in the last 5 years. They're all posted. I don't know whether anybody reads them, but they clarify my own thinking. In fact, I just posted today a blog, Lewis. You might get a kick out of it. It's called "Why I Can't Write an Essay," because I'm thinking about what it means to write an essay. But
I'd like that one.
But where I am unusual is that when I am writing anything, and this is very unusual, I've only found one other person who's like this, I try to spit the whole thing out. So even if it's going to be a book of 50,000 words, I try in a month to write the whole thing out, because I just want to spit it out and see what it looks like. And then every book I've written has had 3 or 4 drafts, every blog the same thing, but I need to see the whole thing in front of me. Now, if it's a book, I might drop a chapter, or I might change chapter orders, or I might add a chapter, and I'm certainly going to change some of my language and so on. But I feel the need to have the gestalt, the whole thing. And my wife is totally different. And most people who are writers are more like that. They write a page and they work on it and they move on to the next page and so on. It's more like a poet, but I'm very non-poetic. I want to see, to use a technical expression, the whole schmear. And then I
suspect you feel that way because you have a synthesizing mind. At this point, my assistant, Claudette, is going to take questions from the audience, and give them to you, and maybe to me too, but mostly to you. So if you don't mind, Claudette, are you there? And can you do that?
Hi, Lewis. Hi, Dr. Gardner.
Hi.
So we have a few questions in the chat box. The first question is from Bridget M. And she wants to know, has Noam Chomsky's writing about humans' linguistic structure had an impact on your thoughts?
The answer to that is simple. Yes. Noam Chomsky's view of cognition, how people think, which was developed in the 50s and 60s, had enormous impact on how I think about human cognition. And in fact, when I wrote a book called The Mind's New Science about cognitive science, his work was one of the work that I featured. In general, the notion of different kinds of intelligence is very consistent with Chomsky's idea of the human mind having long developed evolutionary capacities like language or music or so on. So yeah, I've been very influenced by Chomsky. I'm lucky enough to know him. I used to go to his courses, but I wasn't a student of linguistics, so it was kind of for extra credit. I also admire his work in politics, though I don't always agree with it. And I think it's rather scandalous that so few American newspapers and magazines publish his writings, because abroad they're very, very widely accessed. Of course, he writes many books and those are available, but he's been enormous influence on so many people. I think he's probably the most important public intellectual of our time. And he's in his 90s and going strong. You're muted now.
Yeah, there we go. The next question is from Edwin Martinez. Dr. Gardner, since your theory states that there are 8 intelligences, how can the Board of Education in African American and Latino communities explore the 8 intelligences to tap into the children's minds to help them excel in state exams and specialized exams, as well as in the classroom curriculum?
Okay, this is probably a politically incorrect answer, but I've always avoided talking about teaching any particular demography different from any other one. I think it's a very dangerous road to go down. In fact, in the book, I talk about what got me involved in studying good work and ethics was a well-intentioned study done in Australia in the early 1990s, where they took all the racial and ethnic groups in Australia, including Aborigines. It listed all the intelligences they had and all the intelligences they lacked. And I said, oh my God, this is just a perversion of what I believe, because I believe, the human mind and the human brain is capable of developing all these capacities. But with respect to the questioner, who I'm sure is well-intentioned, I think that education involves parents as well as teachers, as well as social media like Twitter and Facebook and so on. And children's minds are formed by the persons whom they are in contact with and by the media with which they interact, and of course by the course materials that they encounter. And the more you can align those, the more that what parents value and what schools convey and what kids do when they're busy doing Minecraft or Twitter or whatever they're doing, I think that the more likely they will be to have a good education. Where I think your question has merit is in what I said earlier, namely kids who grow up in more affluent communities, which tend not to be communities of minorities, are more likely to get a multiple intelligence broad education, whereas in our inner cities, for many reasons, which we could talk about, they're more likely to get a rather strict curriculum, which tends to pick out those kids who are good at language and logic, but it misses kids who are good spatially or good musically or good artistically or good in understanding other people. And here's the important point. To the extent that the schools and the media don't nourish those intelligences, it's really up to parents to do so. And going to children's museum, going on trips, having different kinds of experiences, they don't have to cost any money, is the best way to activate the different intelligences. And then you have to pray that when the kids go off on their own, there be young adults, that they can use their intelligences in ways which are not only productive for work and for family, but also use it in what we call a good project kind of way, an ethical way. So thank you for that question.
Great. The next question is from Linda Greenhouse. Howard, you said two inconsistent things. One, that you learn what you think by writing, but two, that you like to write the whole thing out all at once. So which is it?
Well, Linda is a friend, and as many people will know, a wonderful expert on the legal system in the United States, a writer about that, and also now the head of the American Philosophical Society. That's a great question because it actually does helps me say what I do. I mentioned that every day I go on a walk by myself, and when I come back, I jot down things, and I may actually write a blog. And that's actually the raw material for what will eventually become a book. So in a sense, you might say the raw material has been done, but it's rough. For example, now I've been reading every day or two a new biography. I've been reading about a biography of John Maynard Keynes, the economist, of Hannah Arendt, the political philosopher. I just an hour ago finished a biography of George Soros, and I'm going to read one of Warren Buffett, and I just take some notes about that. If I were going to write a book a year from now, which I don't intend to do, about great synthesizers in our time, that would be the raw material. So the answer is I've essentially done the sketches like an artist would do, but then when I come to do the final canvas, I just want to spit it all out. But thanks for a great question. A great question is one which clarifies your own thinking.
Next question is from Scott Daspin. How does emotional intelligence intersect with software like Palantir?
There's a lot packed into that question. Scott, is that the name?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, first of all, as background, emotional intelligence is not a word that I coined or that I particularly use. It's Dan Goleman's creation. But when I talk about personal intelligence as understanding of other people or understanding of yourself, it's the same general territory. If you work in artificial intelligence and you are a true believer, you believe that anything that human beings do made out of flesh and blood and skin and bones can be reduced, so to speak, to zeros and ones. And so I actually have been working by coincidence with a colleague this week who's trying to create a program for dealing with people who are looking for a new job. And he wants to do it entirely through artificial intelligence. So the idea there would be that anything that a human employer or human relations person could do by interacting the way I am with you now, Claudette, could be done simply by zeros and ones. But when I said I'm not willing to trust Palantir to define the question or to decide, which law to pass and how to pass it, I don't think that everything that we human beings do in our interactions with other people are easy to capture. Though, I have to admit at the same time, all sorts of things which nobody 50 years ago thought computers could do are now being done by, for example, looking at you. I'm assuming you're a human being and you're smiling and you're blinking your eyes and moving back and forth, but you could be some kind of a robot. You could be a simulacrum of a person, and I'd be fooled by that. So don't bet in the long run against Palantir, but in the short run, I'd rather, I wouldn't say I'd rather have the American Congress do it because they can't do anything, but I would probably send it to Sweden or Singapore, two very different places which do manage to get things done. Finland, maybe more than Sweden.
The next question is from Melissa Merrick. Your past major of social relations sounded a lot
So
like
that's it.
what
You have some
social,
more?
yeah. So Melissa Merrick asks, your past major of social relations sounded a lot like what social work is today. Have you had the opportunity to work with social workers in your career? I'm very interested in the interplay of education, well-being, and social work, and I definitely see the similarities in some of your past work. P.S. I'm a
Okay.
recent graduate at Hunter, hence my interest.
Oh, okay, well, good. Thank you, Melissa. Well, I haven't employed or used social workers directly, but several people are in my family are social workers. I know what they do. And I've been in hospitals where social workers come to you and other people, and I observe what they do. So I have some understanding. I would say that a background in SOCREL would be very useful for somebody, for anybody really, who's dealing with other human beings, because it was an effort, perhaps a little bit premature, around 1950, to think about human beings and human behaviors from the point of view of psychology, how the mind and brain works, from the point of view of sociology, how groups work, and from the point of view of anthropology, how cultures work. I would say that the difference is that SOCREL, or social relations, a terrible name, is basically an academic discipline. And so it's training people to be scholars and researchers. Social work is a profession, and professions are groups of individuals who have certain practices which they learn how to do. They try to carry them out in ways which are excellent and ethical and engaged. That's what good work is. It's work that's excellent in quality, it's personally engaging, and it's carried out in an ethical way. So my answer to Melissa is that I think SOCREL, or any kind of interdisciplinary work about the human condition, would be an excellent background, but it's not the same as learning how to be a good therapist, how to ask the right questions, how to help people find appropriate niche if they're sick and they have to go to rehab, or if their family is broken, things like that. So it's sort of like, if you want to go to law school, it's very helpful to have studied politics and economics and philosophy and mathematics. Larry Tribe was a mathematician, but it's different from learning how to be a lawyer.
The next question is from Ellie Imperato. Is Piaget still relevant today in books on child raising? I remember reading about him when my children were growing up about 30 years ago.
I love that question because my wife and I, and we were actually talking with Bill Damon, who was mentioned earlier by Lewis, and his wife, Ann Cloby, were all psychologists. And we were ruining the fact that people say, oh, Freud, nobody reads Freud anymore, he's been disproved. Or Piaget, nobody reads him anymore because we know more than he does. Of course, what we know is what he told us. While I think it is true that you don't have to read the great thinkers to pick up some of their thinking, because of course it gets absorbed by the rest of the culture, there's no substitute for seeing how a great thinker attacked problems. So for example, I said I was reading the economist John Maynard Keynes and the political philosopher Hannah Arendt. A lot of their ideas are now part of the breathing atmosphere. Even Richard Nixon said we're all Keynesians, but it's no substitute for going back and actually reading what they wrote and how they wrote about it. And I used to say 25 years ago, if we could get rid of all of developmental psychology or get rid of Piaget, I'd rather get rid of all developmental psychology because I think he's so fundamental. I don't know if I would say that again today because it's a different story, but I would say the same thing about Chomsky, and his contributions to linguistics are just without equal, even though in some ways the field has gone off in different directions. But America is determinedly non-historical. In many ways, that's been very good for our society. We're not like Serbia, where they're fighting a war from 500 years ago or 700 years ago, though I guess we are fighting the Civil War more than I thought we would. But part of our non-historicism, of our anti-historicism, is the feeling we can't learn from something that was done a while ago. T.S. Eliot, arguably one of the great American and English poets of the 20th century, was sitting with a young poet, and the young poet was saying to Eliot, "Oh, those old guys, we know so much more. We know so much more than they do." And Eliot said, "Yes, they are what we know." And so I personally think, and I try to encourage my kids and grandchildren and my students and grand students not to dismiss something just because it wasn't done in the 21st century.
This next question is from Kirsha Dillon. Everyone seems to know that the US system that relies heavily on testing does not work. In fact, when you look at countries like Finland, testing is de-emphasized. Why has nothing changed over the years in the United States?
All right, Kirsha, I'm going to give you an answer which I have begun to use. People say to me, "Oh, Dr. Gardner, you're a well-known educator. Who should be the Secretary of Education?" And I've come up with an answer in the last year. I said, I think we should abolish the Department of Education. The Department of Education was started with the best of motives by President Jimmy Carter in the late 70s. And it was an effort to sort things out in education in the United States. But it has been a political football since then. Betsy DeVos pushed it very much in one direction. The new secretary, who was the head of education in Connecticut, is going to move it in the entirely opposite direction. And it's the opposite of civil service. It's uncivil service. We don't agree. We just play ping pong or table tennis or whatever with one another. So that's my political rant. But I think that if we were to get rid of the Department of Education, except for giving scholarships and fellowships, and pay teachers 3 times as much, we would have an educational system second to none. But we try to do education on the cheap. It's one of the few things which actually have joined the left and the right, is when state legislators try to get teachers to be paid even less, or more likely communities, that finally there were rebellions in places like Arizona. So I would say in this country, get rid of the feds because they can't handle education, and pay teachers a decent salary and give them a good career path. Teaching 7-year-olds for 40 years may not be that exciting, but teaching it well, then helping other teachers, then becoming the head teacher, which is what they call principals in other countries, that's the way we'd have a good educational system. I'm very depressed by the K-12 system in this country, because it'd be so easy to make it so much better. But it's very much like the health system, very good for people who have lots of shekels, but not good for people who don't. I've just finished a book with Wendy Fishman about higher education. That's the one we're trying to come up with a title for. And higher education in this country has been admired throughout the world, but I'm very worried that some of the same things that have happened to K-12 are happening to higher education too. It's just sinful that a country with so many resources can't do better by our whole population.
The next question is from Elise Orekio. Dr. Gardner, can you please speak a bit to how an autistic or neurodiverse mind synthesizes information? Thank you.
Wow, that's a first, Denise. Nobody has asked me that question before. I do think that being an excellent synthesizer is not antithetical to being on the spectrum, which is my way of talking about autism. I think if you're severely autistic, it's probably, if you are synthesizing, you're going to be doing it in a way that most of us can't recognize. But I think that the capacity to take a lot of information in is often a characteristic of people who are on the spectrum. And you then need to give them an impetus and tools to synthesize. There's a very well-known person who I'm not going to name because it would be unprofessional, who I think is quite on the spectrum and is an expert synthesizer. But I will describe one of the people who, this will take a minute or two, but if Lewis will permit me, I was writing a biography of a man who I thought was the most interesting mind that I'd ever encountered. And I was well into it when he was arrested for pedophilia. His name is Carlton Gajdacek. He is a Nobel Prize winner. And I made the difficult decision not to complete the book. But recently I've gone back and I'm actually thinking and writing about him now because he's long deceased. Carlton had an incredible mind, could take everything in, had it instantly at his mental footsteps, his cerebral capacity. He wrote perhaps 50 or 100 journals. All the information is there for synthesis, but he was never able to do it himself. He won the Nobel Prize for work, which was very excellent work, but it was not work that required unusual amounts of synthesis. Other scientists did. He had all the information there, and when I was with him, I could see that he was on the spectrum, but the actual sitting down and putting it in a way that other people can understand is difficult. But that's a great question, and if I lived another 50 or 100 years, I would try to study the relationship between the spectrum and synthesis, but it's certainly not impossible.
Marjorie wants to know, how do you think people in their elder years can develop their creativity?
Well, actually, the New Yorker ran an article about this earlier in January. I don't remember the name of the author, but she talked about older people daring to try new things and doing them very well. She actually talked about multiple intelligences. That's how I saw it. But then in the New Yorker, which just arrived today, there's a letter from a woman who's in her late 60s and talked about two things which she got better at. She said, but there was one thing that she isn't going to get better at. I guess it was reading sheet music. So she stopped there. So this is a question that's kind of in the air now. I think that one important thing about being old is you don't have to prove yourself anymore. So you can take chances and risks, which you might not have taken when you thought everybody was looking at you or you were getting graded and so on. So I think that that's one of the important aspects of creativity, which is open to you. However, I think I'd be dishonest if I said that if you don't have skills already latent there, Grandma Moses was a famous person 50 or 100 years ago who became a well-known painter, even though she started painting only late in life. But I'm absolutely sure that if she had drawn as a young child, she would already have shown some talent in that area. And I think the same thing is true for anybody who's a late bloomer. But you don't have to be creative in a sense that the rest of the world looks at it. You just have to, it has to be something that's new for you and something that's enjoyable. I have to admit that I spent most of my life not paying much attention to nature, except when I was a Boy Scout and I had to learn all the trees and all the plants and birds to get a merit badge. But in my daily walks, I spend more time looking at nature than I ever did before. I'm constantly sending photographs to my granddaughter. Is that creative? It certainly wouldn't make National Geographic, but it's fun for me. And if my granddaughter gets a kick out of it, so much the better.
The next question from Esther Dyson asks, what question intrigues you most now?
Hi, Esther. Esther is another friend and phenomenal person in the realm of computing and ethics and medicine. I guess that I'm really most interested in knowing whether work is going to become entirely different in the next 50 years. Now, of course, I won't be around to see it, but as Esther knows, for many years, and John Maynard Keynes was famous for people say work people are going to have a lot of leisure. They're not going to be able to work, and they're going to have to amuse themselves, or we have to create new activities. And of course, it's never happened. Every time there was a prediction like that, we ended up creating new kinds of work, including in computing and so on. But I do think, like everybody else in the pandemic, I would be lost without Amazon and other companies which can just get stuff to you. So I think the whole retail business and things like restaurants and movie theaters are going to disappear. So I guess I'm really interested, Esther, if I could come back from wherever I'm sentenced after I pass to see the world in 100 years, I'd love to know what people do. How do they spend their time? Are they exploring outer space, which would keep them busy? Are they trying to develop everybody's abilities to the fullest, whether or not there's any work? Will we judge people not by how smart they are, but by how good they are? Or will people, and this is kind of thing, your brother George, your father Freeman would probably be interested in, will we more and more intertwine with computational wear, or with new brains that are created, and there'll be new species which I can't even begin to imagine. But because I've been working on work for so long, and I really think this is finally the time when it's going to be completely qualitatively refashioned, I'd love to understand that better. And in fact, 2 of the projects I'm working on now are about helping people think about work in the future, because it isn't like when you and I and Linda, we all went to college a long time ago, well, the only question was, would we be a lawyer? Would we be a doctor? Would we be a journalist? Would we be a scientist? I think there are going to be new questions that are going to be asked, and I'd love to know what they're going to be. But that's a wonderful question.
The next question is from Christian Paxton. Lewis, you're muted, so just unmute yourself on the bottom left corner. I can't hear you. You're still muted.
We have to lip read.
There we go.
No, that was me. That was Howard.
I say we can take one more question, and then I want to thank Howard.
Okay, great. So the final question is from Christian Paxton. He asks, as mentioned, our US education system is in a dire state. Your mention earlier of the importance of media in a child's development brings to mind the mass manipulation we are witnessing by media sources. Which intelligence would you say a person's own, quote, critical thinking is categorized under? Intrapersonal, interpersonal, existential?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. And of course, like everybody whom I know who's been watching this, which question we think about all the time. But I'm going to give perhaps an unexpected answer. I think that the education that we need in the future obviously has to draw on the intelligences that human beings have, but it's going to be focused much more on role models whom we admire, not because of what they say, but because of what they do, and how we watch how they do it, and we feel that what they're doing is benign rather than malignant. Because you can have the greatest linguistic intelligence or spatial intelligence in the world, but you can use it for very perverse kinds of purposes. And so it's when you have role models and mentors, or what we call paragons, people whom you don't know personally because they're dead, or you can't reach them, or they're in the Bible, or they're in the Greek myths. It's when you have individuals like that whom you respect and whom you admire and who you want to be like, that's when you'll be using your intelligences in a benign way. I always say both Goethe, the German poet, and Goebbels, the German propagandist, had plenty of linguistic intelligence, but Goethe used it to write great drama and poetry and essays, and Goebbels used it to create hatred. So the intelligence, here's a way of putting it for, I forget the name, is this Christian? The intelligences are the raw material, but the uses to which they put are really the name of the game. And we have to learn from people whom we admire and try to be like them. And it's not what these people say, it's what they do. Because you can talk a good game, but it's the actual actions that they carry out. So that's a somber note, but it's also an answer I could have given to Esther Dyson, because of course I think about this all the time as well. Lewis,
Claudette, can you hear me?
Yes, I'm going to
Okay,
log off.
I want to say that Howard is a perfect example of the beneficent type of intelligence that he was describing. And I want to thank him for the wonderful talk and being so patient with all the questions. And I want to thank the audience for coming too. And though I don't know you, Esther Dyson, I did know your father, Freeman, and admired him greatly. Howard, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and your knowledge. And I hope all of the audience will read A Synthesizing Mind, your new memoir, which is published by MIT Press. Thank you very much.
thank you, Lewis, and thanks for the wonderful questions as well. Bye-bye.
Pleasure. Bye.